I was 17 years old, my sister was 14. And the only thing we owned in the world were the backpacks on our backs, because our parents had just locked the front door and told us not to come back. There was no big argument, no screaming match that built to a breaking point. That's what people always assume when they hear a story like this. They imagine some dramatic scene, plates thrown, voices cracking, a door slamming so hard the windows rattle. But that's not how it happened. It was quiet. That was almost the worst part. My father said the words in the same tone he used to tell us dinner was ready. My mother stood behind him and looked at the floor. And then the door closed and the lock clicked. I stood on that sidewalk for what felt like a very long time. The street was gray. Not dark, not dramatic, just gray, the way everything looks when the sky can't decide between clouds and light. A car passed slowly at the far end of the block. Somewhere down the road, a dog was barking at nothing. Normal sounds. Ordinary sounds. The kind of sounds that have no idea your world just ended. Lena, my sister, she didn't cry right away. She just slid her hand into mine and held it so tight I could feel her pulse. She was 14 years old, and she was already trying to be strong for me. That detail still sits in my chest like something heavy that never fully dissolved. I looked down at my bag. One backpack. Clothes for maybe 3 days. A phone with 40% battery and no active plan. $11 in cash. And a granola bar I'd been saving since Tuesday. That was it. That was the full inventory of our lives as of that afternoon. We stood there for a while because neither of us knew which direction to walk. There's a particular kind of paralysis that sets in when every option in front of you looks equally impossible. Left felt wrong, right felt worse. Standing still felt like giving up. So we just stood there on the edge of that ordinary gray street. 2 kids holding hands outside the house they grew up in, trying to figure out what you do after the people who were supposed to protect you simply decide not to anymore. I thought about calling someone, a friend, a teacher, anyone. But there's a shame that comes with a moment like that. A strange, irrational shame that isn't yours to carry but lands on you anyway. I couldn't form the sentence. I didn't know how to explain what had just happened when I barely understood it myself. And then, out of nowhere, a memory surfaced. Not a recent one, an old one, soft around the edges, the kind of memory that lives in the back of your mind for years without asking for attention. My grandmother, sitting at her kitchen table, stirring tea she'd already forgotten about, saying something almost to herself more than to me. I've got a little cabin up by the ridge, nothing fancy, but it's mine. And it'll always be there if it needs to be. I hadn't thought about that in years. I didn't even know if I'd heard it right. I didn't know where the ridge was, or if the cabin still existed, or if I was about to drag my 14-year-old sister on a chase after something that had never been more than a passing comment from a woman who had been gone for 2 years. But we had $11, a dead-end sidewalk, and nowhere else to go. So I picked up my bag, Lena picked up hers, and we started walking. If this story already has you feeling something, hit that subscribe button, because what we found inside that cabin changed everything. Drop your country in the comments right now. I want to know where in the world you're watching this from. And if you've ever felt like you had nowhere to go, like your life is hitting you harder than it should, give this video a like. You'll understand why by the end. We had no address, no map, just a name my grandmother had whispered once, the cabin by the ridge, and nowhere else to go. People always want to know what kind of home produces a moment like that. What kind of parents put their children on a sidewalk with a backpack and a locked door? I've thought about how to explain it 100 times, and I still don't have a clean answer. Because it wasn't one thing. It never is. Our house was never allowed one. There were no explosions, no chaos, no obvious villain you could point to and say, there, that's the problem. It was quieter than that. It was a house where love felt like something you had to earn every single day, and where the rules for earning it kept changing without anyone telling you. My father moved through rooms like he was tolerating them. My mother smiled in the way people smile when they've forgotten what they're supposed to be smiling about. We weren't abused in the ways people recognize easily. We were just managed, maintained, like obligations that had been taken on before the full cost was understood. I learned early to read the temperature of a room before I entered it. Lena learned to be small, to take up as little space as possible, to ask for as little as she could get away with, to make herself easy to overlook. She was 14 and she had already mastered the art of being invisible in her own home. That is not something a child should ever have to master. And then there was Grandma. She was my mother's mother, which always felt like a strange accident of genetics, because the two of them were nothing alike. Where my mother was distant, Grandma was present. Where my mother spoke in short sentences that closed off conversation, Grandma asked questions and then actually waited for the answers. Her hands were always warm. That sounds like a small detail, but when you grow up in a cold house, you remember warm hands. She smelled like cedar and something sweet I could never name, and when she hugged you, she held on for just a second longer than expected, long enough to mean it. Every time we visited her, which was never often enough, she would find a moment to pull me aside. She'd press folded bills into my palm, sometimes $10, sometimes $20, and close my fingers around them before I could argue. For emergencies, she always said just that. No lecture, no conditions for emergencies. As if she already knew emergencies were coming and wanted to make sure I had something in my hand when they arrived. The last time I saw her was about 4 months before she passed. I was 15. She had been quieter than usual that visit, more thoughtful, the way people get when something is sitting on their mind that they haven't decided to share yet. At some point in the afternoon, while Lena was in the other room, Grandma looked at me with an expression I didn't fully understand until much later. It was the look of someone making a decision. "I have a place," she said, "up by the ridge, my place. Not family's, mine. I've kept it that way for a reason." She paused, like she was going to say more, and then she just patted my hand and changed the subject. I didn't push. I was 15, and I didn't know that conversation would become the most important one of my life. She was gone 8 months later, and whatever she had almost said that afternoon went with her. Now I was on a bus with my 14-year-old sister, a crumpled piece of paper with Grandma's last known address written on it in my handwriting. Because it was the only starting point I could think of, and the thin, fragile thread of a half-remembered conversation keeping us moving forward. Grandma never talked much about the cabin, which, I was starting to realize, probably meant it mattered more than anything else she owned. The bus dropped us at the edge of a town so small it barely had a name worth remembering. One main road, a gas station with a sun-bleached awning, a diner with a hand-painted sign that had been weathered down to suggestions of letters. The kind of place that exists mostly as a dot on a map that nobody zooms in on. We stepped off with our bags and stood on the roadside while the bus pulled away, and I felt the specific loneliness of arriving somewhere you've never been with no one expecting you. The air was different out here, cooler, thicker, carrying pine and something earthy underneath. After the gray concrete smell of the city, it hit differently. Not unpleasant, just unfamiliar. Everything out here was unfamiliar. Lena looked around slowly, taking it all in. Then she looked at me. "Are we sure Grandma wasn't secretly a forest witch?" she said, completely deadpan. I laughed. I didn't expect to, but I did. And for about 4 seconds, everything was almost okay. That was Lena. Even scared, even exhausted, even standing on a road she'd never seen before with everything she owned on her back, she found the angle that made it slightly less heavy. I had always been the one who planned, who worried, who tracked the details. She had always been the one who made it bearable. We worked in a way our family never did. I asked for directions at the gas station first. The man behind the counter was older, weathered in the way people get when they've spent most of their life outdoors. I described the area, mentioned the ridge, gave my grandmother's name. Something shifted in his face. Not alarm exactly, more like recognition followed immediately by caution. He told me the road I was looking for was about 2 miles north. Said I'd see a fork and should take the left. He said it quickly, like he wanted to be helpful but also wanted the conversation to be over. I thanked him, and we left. Outside, Lena tugged my sleeve. "Did that feel weird to you?" she asked. It had. I didn't say so. The walk took the better part of an hour. The road narrowed as we went, the asphalt giving way to gravel, the gravel giving way to packed dirt. Trees pushed in close on both sides. The sounds changed. Less wind, more birds, the occasional crack of something moving through underbrush that I chose not to think too hard about. Lena stayed close. She didn't complain once, not about the distance. Not about her bag straps cutting into her shoulders the way I could see they were from the way she kept adjusting them. She just walked. We found the fork where the man said we would. We took the left. And maybe a 1/4 mile down, almost completely swallowed by tall grass and low branches that had been reaching across the path for years, there it was. A mailbox, rusted red-brown, leaning slightly like it had been tired for a long time. But on the side, still readable beneath the oxidation, 2 initials pressed into the metal in a simple stamp. Her initials. I put my hand on it and just stood there for a moment. Beyond the mailbox was a path. Or what had been a path. The outline of it was still visible if you knew to look, but nature had been quietly, patiently reclaiming it. Grass grew thick down the center. Branches crossed overhead like a low ceiling. At the far end of it, just at the point where the tree line thickened into shadow, there was a shape. Dark, angular, half-wrapped in ivy, something man-made, and between us and it, a gate. Old iron set into 2 wooden posts with a chain looped through the latch end. Not rusted, not old, new. The path hadn't been walked in a long time, maybe years. But someone had locked the gate, and that meant someone had wanted to keep something in. The gate took some effort. The chain was stiff, the iron cold against my palms, but it swung open without fighting us too hard, like it had been maintained just enough to still function. That detail registered somewhere in the back of my mind, but I didn't stop to examine it yet. I was too focused on what was at the end of the path. We pushed through the overgrowth slowly, branches dragging against our bags, the ground soft and uneven underfoot. And then the trees thinned, the path widened slightly, and we stepped into a small clearing. The cabin was there. I don't know exactly what I had expected. Something collapsed, maybe. Rotted boards and a caved roof, nature having finished what time started. The kind of ruin that tells you, clearly, nothing here, move on. That would have almost been easier. Instead, what I found stopped me mid-step and held me there. It was small. 1 room, maybe 2 if there was a back partition. Dark wood exterior, aged but not broken, the roof was intact. The porch boards were worn but unsplintered. Moss had crept up one side wall and ivy had made a project of the eastern corner, but the structure beneath it all was solid, deliberate, like something that had been built to last and had quietly gone about doing exactly that. The overgrowth around it felt less like neglect and more like a kind of camouflage, like the cabin had been tucked away on purpose. Lena stood beside me and neither of us said anything for a long moment. Then I saw the door. Old wood, same weathered dark as the rest of the exterior, but the lock on it was nothing like the cabin. It was heavy, modern, and clean. A thick steel body with a short shackle, the kind you'd find securing a storage unit or a job site. Not a scratch on it, not a trace of rust. Against the aged grain of that old door, it looked almost aggressive, wrong. Like someone had reached across time and bolted something contemporary onto something that belonged to a different era entirely. "That's not an old lock," Lena said quietly. "No," I agreed. "It's not." My mind started moving quickly. My grandmother had been gone for 2 years. This cabin, by every appearance, had been closed up and untouched for at least that long, longer, maybe. So why would a modern padlock be sitting on a door in the middle of nowhere, on a property most people didn't know existed? I unzipped the front pocket of my bag and took out the small key ring. It had come to me in an envelope after Grandma passed. Her personal effects, the things she'd had on her at the end. Most of the keys I'd never been able to identify. I'd kept them anyway, the way you keep things that belong to someone you loved even when you don't know what they open. There were 4 keys on the ring. 3 looked like ordinary house keys. The 4th was different, shorter, with a specific cut and a small rubber grip worn smooth from handling. I stared at it. Then I looked at the lock. That was when Lena grabbed my arm. "Hey," she said, her voice dropped low. "Look at the window." I looked. The window beside the door was small and dark, but hanging on the inside, pressed close to the glass, were curtains. White fabric, simple, folded neatly at the edges, clean, undusty, recently placed. The air between us shifted. Before I tell you what was behind that door, subscribe if you haven't already, because this is the part where everything starts to shift. Comment your country below. I'm reading every single one. And like this video if you're already getting a weird feeling about this cabin, because trust me, your instincts are right. I stepped up to the door, held the small key to the lock and pressed it in. The key fit perfectly, and that terrified me more than if it hadn't fit at all. The lock released with a single clean click. I pushed the door open slowly, not from fear exactly, but from something close to instinct, the same way you move when you sense that whatever is on the other side deserves a certain kind of care. The hinges didn't scream or protest. They turned quietly, like they'd been oiled, like they'd been maintained. The smell reached me first, cedar, dried herbs. Something faintly sweet underneath, like old paper and wood polish mixed together. It was not the smell of abandonment. It was not the smell of a place that had been left to decay. It was the smell of somewhere that had been tended to, closed up and waiting, but not forgotten. I stepped inside. Lena followed, pressing close behind me. The room was dim, the only light coming from the doorway behind us and the thin gray afternoon filtering through that small curtained window. I stood still for a moment, letting my eyes adjust, and as the space came into focus, I stopped breathing for just a second. It was arranged. That was the only word that fit. Not messy, not abandoned, not frozen in the middle of something interrupted. Arranged, deliberately, intentionally. Every object in that room was exactly where someone had decided it should be. A small wooden table sat at the center with 2 chairs tucked beneath it, A lantern placed precisely in the middle of the surface, a box of matches beside it like a quiet instruction. Along the far wall, shelves had been built directly into the wood, rough but sturdy, and they were lined with glass jars. Preserved food, carefully labeled in handwriting I couldn't yet read from where I stood. Beans, grains, dried fruit, things that would keep for a long time, enough to last. In the corner closest to the window, a cot had been set up with a folded blanket on top, edges squared off like a made bed. A second, smaller cot was folded flat and leaning against the adjacent wall, as if waiting to be opened. Two cots. I felt something move through my chest that I didn't have a name for yet. Lena made a small sound behind me, not quite a word, just breath catching in her throat. I understood completely. And then I saw the notebooks. They were everywhere, and yet somehow not chaotic, stacked on the far end of the shelves. Arranged in 2 short piles on the table, 3 more tucked carefully on a narrow ledge above the cot. Dozens of them in total, the same kind, plain covers, different colors, spines worn from handling. They had not been thrown here. They had been placed here, organized in a way that suggested order, intention, a system only one person fully understood. I crossed the room and picked up the one sitting on top of the nearest stack. The cover was a deep, faded blue. I turned it over in my hands, and something about the weight of it felt significant in a way I couldn't explain, like holding something that had been waiting specifically for this moment. I opened it. The handwriting hit me before the words did. I would have known it anywhere. The particular way she formed her letters, slightly tilted. The loops on the lowercase letters wider than most. The pen pressed firmly enough to leave a slight ridge on the back of the page. I had grown up watching that handwriting on birthday cards, on folded notes slipped into my jacket pocket, on the backs of envelopes that always smelled faintly like her kitchen. My grandmother's handwriting. I heard Elena stop moving behind me. She had seen it too. The first line of the first page was not a date, it was not a title, it was a name, my name. And beneath it, in the same careful, deliberate hand, 3 words that rearranged everything, for when it happens. I stood there for a long moment with my name staring back at me from that first page. For when it happens, not if, when. She had known. Whatever this was, whatever she had built here and filled and prepared. She had known that one day it would be needed. She hadn't hoped we'd never require it. She had quietly, methodically made sure it would be ready when we did. I sat down on the edge of the cot. Lena sat beside me, close enough that our shoulders touched, and I started to read. The first notebook was practical. That surprised me. I had expected something emotional straight away, and instead the opening pages were almost instructional. Her handwriting walked me through the cabin the way a patient teacher walks a student through something important. The water came from a gravity-fed tank built into the hillside behind the cabin. She described exactly where the intake valve was and how to clear it if it blocked. Firewood was stacked and covered under a lean-to on the north side, enough for several weeks if used carefully. There was a hand-drawn diagram of the shelving system and what each jar contained, organized by how long each item would keep. She had thought about this, the way someone thinks about something they've been planning for a long time. But then, about 12 pages in, the tone shifted. The handwriting was the same, the pen was the same, but the words became something else entirely. I watched you today through the window when your mother brought you both for the holiday. You didn't know I was looking. You were sitting on the back step with Lena, and you were braiding her hair, and I thought, there it is. There's the person you're becoming. And I wanted to come outside and tell you how proud I was, and I didn't, because your mother would have made it strange, and I didn't want to make it strange for you. So I came inside and I wrote it down instead. I hope someday you read this. I stopped reading. The room was very quiet. I turned the page, and the next one, and the next. They were all like that. Observations, moments she had witnessed from the edges of our lives, things she had noticed and felt and had never said aloud because the family dynamic made saying them complicated. The way she had learned to love us quietly, at a careful distance in the only language she felt she was allowed to use, which was silence, and which was these pages. I started reading aloud. I don't know exactly when it happened or why. It just felt wrong to read them alone, like she had written to both of us, and both of us should hear. Lena listened without moving. By the 4th letter, my voice was unsteady. By the 7th, I had to stop twice to get it back. And somewhere around the 9th or 10th, I lost track of exactly when, I heard Lena make a sound beside me that she'd been holding in for a long time. I put my arm around her, and she leaned in, and we sat like that in that small cedar-smelling room while the afternoon light moved slowly across the floor, reading the words of a woman who had loved us more carefully and more completely than we had ever fully understood while she was alive. She had written 63 letters. I counted them later, when I could count again. One for every month she had been worried about us, which meant she had started writing them 5 years before she died. 5 years of watching, noticing, worrying, loving, all of it folded into these notebooks that nobody was ever supposed to find until the moment we needed to find them. The last letter was dated 2 weeks before she died. I almost couldn't open it, but I did. The handwriting was slightly shakier than the others, the letters a little less even, like the pen had been harder to hold. But the words were clear. She had made sure of that. Check under the third board from the left. You'll need what's there. I read the line again, then a third time. Check under the third board from the left. You'll need what's there. Lena was already looking at the floor. The floorboards were wide pine, darkened with age, running the length of the cabin from the door to the back wall. I stood up and moved toward the left side of the room, her left, the way she would have been standing if she were facing the door, and started counting. 1, 2. The third board looked identical to every other board in the room. Same color, same width, same worn surface. But when I crouched down and pressed my fingers along the edge, I felt it. A slight give, a gap marginally wider than the boards beside it, the faint absence of the resistance the others had. Someone had cut it. Someone had made it removable and then made it look like they hadn't. Hold the lantern, I said. Lena had already lit it. I hadn't even noticed her do it, but she had found the matches on the table and gotten it going without being asked. She held it low and steady over my hands while I worked my fingers into the gap at the edge of the board. It took effort. The board had been fitted carefully, not nailed, but seated tightly so it wouldn't shift under normal movement. I worked it side to side, feeling it loosen incrementally, and then it lifted, clean and deliberate, like a door within a door. Beneath it was a hollow, roughly the size of a shoebox, maybe slightly deeper, cut into the subfloor with clean edges, not roughly dug out but carefully constructed. And sitting inside it, completely at odds with the rough timber surrounding it, was a box. Hard-sided, dark green, with a rubber seal running around the lid and 2 metal clasps on the front. Waterproof. I lifted it out with both hands. It was heavier than it looked. I set it on the table, and Lena set the lantern beside it, and we both just looked at it for a moment. The light flickered slightly in a draft from somewhere, and our shadows moved on the walls behind us, and the whole room felt like it was holding its breath along with us. I unclipped the 2 clasps and opened the lid. The first thing I saw was a document, folded in thirds, printed on paper that had been kept in perfect condition by the seal of the box. I picked it up and unfolded it carefully. It was a land deed. For this property, for this exact parcel of land, the cabin and the surrounding acreage, registered and stamped and entirely legal. I read through it slowly, not quite trusting what I was seeing, and then I found the name in the designated ownership line, and I had to sit down. My name, my full name, spelled out completely as the sole named owner of the property. She had transferred it. Sometime before she died, quietly, without telling anyone in the family, she had transferred the deed of this land into my name. I was 17 years old and I owned a piece of land. Beneath the deed was a savings passbook. Small, burgundy-colored, the kind that belongs to a particular type of old account that most banks don't even offer anymore. I opened it to the last page and looked at the transaction history. Small deposits made consistently, monthly, sometimes twice a month, going back years, further back than I expected. The amounts were modest individually. Together, accumulated over that much time, they had become something else entirely. Something that meant we could breathe. For months, if we were careful. For longer, if we were smart. My hands were not entirely steady. The last item in the box was an envelope. Cream-colored, sealed, and written on the front in the handwriting I now felt I could recognize in my sleep were 3 words. Read this together. I looked at Lena. She looked at me. She sat down on the floor cross-legged, the way she used to sit as a little kid, and I sat across from her. I opened the envelope. The letter inside was 2 pages, front and back, and I read it aloud in the lantern light with my voice doing its best to stay level and mostly failing. She wrote about the cabin first, when she had bought it, why she had kept it separate from everything else she owned, why she had never brought us there while she was alive. She had been afraid that if the family knew it existed, it would become a point of conflict. She had seen enough of how that family worked to know that anything she loved too openly would eventually be used against her, or taken from her in some way. So she had kept it quiet. She had kept it hers. And then, carefully and legally and without fanfare, she had made it ours. She wrote about the money, how she had started saving it years ago, not for any specific purpose at first, just from a feeling she couldn't shake that we might one day need something she couldn't give us in person. She called it her quiet insurance. She said she hoped we never needed it, but she made sure it was there anyway. And then near the end of the second page, she wrote the part that undid me completely. She wrote that she had known. Not everything, she hadn't known exactly how or when, but she had understood the shape of what our home life was. And she had known with a certainty she wouldn't explain that there would come a day when we would need somewhere to go. She had not told us about the cabin while she was alive because she hadn't wanted us to spend our childhoods waiting for the safety net. She had wanted us to keep hoping we wouldn't need it, right up until the moment we did. She had protected our hope on purpose. Even at the cost of her own, the deed had my name on it. The account had enough in it to survive for months. And the letter told us exactly why she'd never told us while she was alive. And that reason broke my heart all over again. She had not been able to intervene directly. That was the part that took me the longest to understand, and the part she spent the most time explaining. It wasn't indifference, it wasn't weakness. It was something older and more complicated than either of those things. A promise she had made to my mother years before we were born, during a period in their relationship that she described only in careful, measured terms. A difficult time. A fracture that had nearly become permanent, and which had only been repaired under specific conditions. One of which was that she would not interfere in how my mother chose to run her household. She had made that promise in good faith, at a time when she believed the household would be a different kind of place than it turned out to be. By the time she understood what she had actually agreed to, the promise had calcified into something she felt she couldn't break without losing access to us entirely. So she had made a different calculation. If she couldn't speak, she would build. If she couldn't intervene, she would prepare. If she couldn't protect us in the open, she would do it in the only way left available to her, quietly, slowly, over years, without anyone knowing. She wrote about specific moments. That was the part that made the room feel very small. She wrote about a Christmas when I was 11 years old and had asked for something small. I barely remembered what it was now, something inconsequential, and had been told no in a way that was designed less to discipline and more to diminish. She had been in the next room. She had heard it. She had stood in the kitchen with her hands flat on the counter and made herself stay where she was, because she had known that if she walked in and said what she wanted to say, she would be asked to leave, and possibly not invited back. She wrote, "I have never hated a promise more than I did in that moment. I went home that night and I put $20 in your account. It was all I could do. It wasn't enough. I knew it wasn't enough." She wrote about Lena. A specific afternoon, a specific look she had seen on Lena's face when she thought nobody was watching. A look she described as a child who has already learned to want less so that being given less hurts less. She wrote that seeing that look had kept her awake for 3 nights. She wrote that she had started saving more aggressively after that, doubling the deposits, cutting her own expenses in ways she didn't detail but that I could imagine. An old woman quietly going without things so that 2 children she wasn't allowed to openly protect would have something waiting for them. I had to stop reading twice. Not because the words were too much, but because my eyes kept blurring and I needed them to work. Lena had stopped trying to hold herself together entirely. She was crying the way people cry when they've been holding something in for so long that it has become structural. And then the structure finally gives. Silently, steadily, without drama. I reached across the floor and held her hand and kept reading. The letter ended gently. She did not close with anything heavy or guilt-laden. She wrote that she hoped the cabin felt like what she had intended it to feel like. Not a last resort, not a symbol of everything that had gone wrong, but a beginning. A place that was fully, legally, unconditionally theirs. She wrote that she believed in us in the specific and detailed way that only people who have been paying close attention can believe in someone. She named things she had seen in each of us, qualities, moments, small acts of character she had observed from her careful distance. She wrote our names at the very end, once each, like a benediction. And then, folded behind the second page of the letter, tucked so precisely against the back of the envelope that I almost missed it, was something else. A second envelope, smaller than the first, still sealed, and on the front, written in the same handwriting, was a name. Not mine, not Lena's, not anyone in our family, a name I had never heard. A woman's name, 2 words, neat and deliberate, with no other explanation on the outside of the envelope. I turned it over, nothing on the back. I looked inside the main envelope again to see if there was any additional context I had missed. And there, written on the very last inch of the second page, below what I had taken to be the end of the letter, was a single additional line I hadn't seen before. Small, easy to miss if you weren't looking carefully. The smaller envelope is not for you to open, it's for you to deliver. You'll understand once you make the call. And below that, a phone number. 10 digits, written clearly, with the same care she had given to every other word in every other notebook in that room. What I'm about to tell you next, I couldn't have made up if I tried. If you're still here, subscribe right now and drop a comment telling me, did you ever have someone love you quietly, from a distance? Because this story is about to go somewhere I never expected. Like this video, we're almost at the part that changed everything for us. The second envelope had a name on it I'd never heard before. But inside there was a phone number and a note in Grandma's handwriting that said, "She's been waiting for your call." I sat with the phone number in front of me for a long time before I dialed it. The lantern was still going, throwing its warm, unsteady light across the floor and the walls and the stacked notebooks and the open lockbox, and all the evidence of a love that had been working quietly in the background of our lives for years without us knowing. Outside, the light had shifted. Later afternoon now, the sky beginning to think about evening. We had been in this cabin for hours. It felt like minutes. It felt like years. Lena sat beside me on the floor, her back against the cot, knees pulled up, the folded land deed on the floor between us like something sacred. She didn't say anything about the call. She just waited. That was her way of saying, "I'm here. Do what you need to do." I dialed. It rang 4 times. I was already composing what I would say to voicemail. Some version of "I don't know if you know who I am," when the line picked up. The voice that answered was older. Calm in the way that comes not from the absence of feeling, but from a long familiarity with it. She said hello, and something about the way she said it made me think she had been expecting this call for a while. Not today specifically, but eventually I told her my name. There was a pause, brief, barely a breath, and then she said, "I know who you are." She talked about you. Both of you. I didn't know what to say to that, so I didn't say anything. She filled the silence gently. She had known my grandmother for over 30 years. Not through the family, but before the family. From a chapter of my grandmother's life that predated my mother, predated the marriage, predated almost everything I had understood to be the fixed beginning of her story. They had been close in the way that certain people become close when they meet at exactly the right moment and recognize something in each other that most people around them don't see. She explained what the notebooks hadn't. The promise my grandmother had made to my mother had roots deeper than I'd understood. A specific event, a specific rupture, the kind of thing that leaves a mark on a family's architecture for generations. My grandmother had not been a passive bystander to our lives. She had spent years in careful negotiation with circumstances that were larger and older than any of us, trying to find the edges of what she was permitted to do and pressing right up against them without crossing the line that would have cut her off from us completely. She had chosen access over intervention, presence over confrontation, and in the margins of what she was allowed, she had built everything. The woman on the phone told me about the cabin, its history, when my grandmother had bought it, what it had meant to her. She told me about the account and how it had been structured legally so that it would pass to me without interference. She told me that my grandmother had called her in the final weeks, when she had still been able to make calls, and had gone through everything one more time. The deed, the notebooks, the lockbox, making sure every detail was in order. She wasn't afraid, the woman said. She just wanted to make sure you'd be okay. That was the only thing she talked about at the end. Lena had her head on my shoulder. I could feel her breathing. I thought about everything. The sidewalk, the backpacks, the gray suburban street, the locked door. I thought about how the worst day of my life had led me here, to this specific floor, in this specific cabin, surrounded by the proof that someone had loved us enough to spend years making sure the worst day wouldn't be the last day. She said Grandma had talked about us until the very end. And then she said something that made me grip my sister's hand so hard my knuckles went white. The months that followed didn't transform overnight. That's not how real recovery works, and I won't pretend otherwise. It was slow, and sometimes it was hard, and there were mornings when the weight of everything that had happened sat on my chest before I even opened my eyes. But we were warm, we were safe, and for the first time in a long time, we were somewhere that was genuinely, legally, unconditionally ours. Lena enrolled in a school in the nearest town about 3 weeks after we arrived. She was nervous the first morning. I remember watching her walk down that overgrown path with her bag on her shoulders and thinking about how much smaller she had always made herself back home, how carefully she had learned to disappear. She stood a little straighter now. Not dramatically, not all at once, just enough that I noticed. The woman from the phone call, her name was Margaret, came to visit about 6 weeks in. She was exactly what her voice had suggested, steady, warm, The kind of person who has lived enough to stop being surprised by life's more complicated arrangements. She brought food, practical things, and she sat at that small wooden table in the cabin and talked with us for hours. She became a presence in our lives in the quiet, consistent way that my grandmother had always operated, not loudly, not with grand gestures, just reliably there. I thought about my parents sometimes, less with anger as the months passed, more with a kind of sad clarity. The understanding that people who cannot give love freely are often people who were never given it freely themselves. That didn't make what they did acceptable, it just made it legible. And legible was something I could set down and walk away from. On an evening sometime in early spring, Lena and I sat on the porch as the sun dropped behind the ridge and turned everything amber and quiet. Neither of us said much. We didn't need to. We were disowned at 17. We had nothing. But Grandma had spent years making sure that nothing was never the end of our story, only the beginning of the one she always believed we deserved. The cabin didn't just save our lives, it gave us back ourselves.